Hey guys, it's Olivie Blake, and this is me not writing. Boy, there is nothing like looking at a webcam to remember all the things that are wrong with you and your face. So, let's see, where to start? I have resumed my first trimester fatigue, so it will be honestly amazing if I don't fall asleep partway through this video. Okay, let's try to get ourselves ready for this talk, part of which is going to be about Armie Hammer. You know what? We'll just jump right into that part because why not? So one of the things I wanted to add to our conversation about, misogyny last week, I like how I've not prefaced this at all. We're just jumping right in with one of the things we love most about the world. So one of the things I wanted to add is the whole Armie Hammer thing is so interesting to me, not because of the cannibalism part. That's weird. But I try not to say things are weird. I know cannibalism is a kink and people act on it without acting on it and that there is definitely a way to engage the kink without actually cannibalizing other human beings, consensually and respectfully. So that's not the weird part for me. The weird part for me is how much is coming up about him and the fact that he's been this way for a really long time. I did not know that Armie Hammer was extremely wealthy. It makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. The construction of Armie Hammer's career as being a white man who comes from inherited wealth and the attitudes that he has about sex just sort of fit into this larger archetype of entitlement, I guess you could say. And what I think is really interesting is how he sort of was very open about the fact that the purpose of adultery in his life was because he'd always had sort of this desire for kinky sex. Fine. But he could no longer work through his kinks with his wife because once his wife had his children, he respected her too much in order to, I don't know how else to say engage his kinks. So we're just going to keep saying that, ultimately reveals that his actual kink is disrespecting his partner, that in order for him to be sexually gratified, he has to do something non-consensually, or he has to do something that objectifies his partner. And that's the real problem. So I was just thinking about this as I was editing my response to, there are things that look weird that aren't necessarily weird. There are lots of behaviors that seem questionable, like having a cannibalism kink, that are not so much the fact that you have them, but it's sort of how you go about it. And now I've of course blanked on the word, but ultimately comes down to how you actually live your life and the kind of decisions that you make and what that says about how you treat your partners, how you sanctify your marriage, all the sort of stuff that is what actually makes Armie Hammer such a problematic person rather than the fact that he has these desires. It's the way that he pursues them and what they indicate about what he actually wants. Because what he actually wants, what he really wanted was to engage in this sort of, whatever sexual act with his partner, his wife, a person that he respects, came to respect only once she had borne his children. It would be something different if it was something that he and his wife were both, part of communally, consensually. And it's very different that he had to seek out a power balance with partners who were extremely, in terms of the power imbalance, very far beneath him, people who functionally couldn't say no. That's where you have the problem. So I think that I just wanted to bring it back to this kind of discussion of it's not always the optics, it's the intent. And it just sort of falls into this larger entitlement about who he is as a person. There's an article about him that's very interesting, not because it centers around him, but because it centers around the fact that he has a career that wouldn't be possible for any person of color, which is something that actually Hassan Minhaj has said very interestingly as well, is that you can be this sort of blandly attractive white man who's not particularly talented and whose movies don't really sell, but you'll continue getting work. The same would not be true for a person of color in his place. And so there's just a lot of things. There's just a lot of things stacking up against Armie Hammer, the least of which is that I didn't like the Rebecca adaptation. As a sidebar, I think that I will be doing something in the fanfiction realm with Rebecca, so that will probably come out sometime this week. I've just finished a manuscript. My other manuscript is with my editor for line edits, and I won't see a lot of things that I have to do for like the next month, but I need to in order to distract myself from getting kicked all the time by my inhabitant. So yeah, I may be doing some more experimental things that you get to see in the next couple of weeks. I'm hoping. There's 2 stories that I'd really like to get done this week that hopefully you will be able to see. So yeah. Okay, so we have writing questions today. Let's see. Hello, Queen. Hello, my liege. I am a new fanfic writer. I've been reading fanfic for almost 20 years, but just now I'm feeling able to write. I'm just finishing up my first novel-length story, and I've been so happy with its outcome. As I contemplate my next, I'm looking into the slow burn style, and this is something that I will try to define as we actually answer the question, but let me just open with a question mark, a footnote with a question mark. So how do I approach slow burn? What's a good amount of time? What's too long? Figured you'd have some wonderful tips and advice. I don't know, we'll see. This has been sort of an interesting conversation lately because, as you know, maybe no, I posted some of my old fics on Wattpad, and people are discovering it for the first time, despite the fact that it's like 5 years old. And there are a lot of people who don't think it's a slow burn and are angry at me actually for saying slow burn in the summary. And for me, this is 2 different things. Part of it is I genuinely, in the time that Clean was written, it was a slow burn. Like people, I think they kiss in chapter 7, and before then people had been kind of like bugging me, like, when is anything going to happen? I don't know if it was just like the pacing of the era was things happened much faster, or I don't know. So it was partially that people were sort of nudging me for like, this is happening very slowly, or the relationship development is very slow. And so when I revamped the summary, because initially when I first started writing, I had no idea what the story was going to be about, so it didn't really even have a summary until I put the slow burn in it and got fewer of those complaints. So part of me does think that it's just like partly a product of its time. That's just like a lot of the other stories that were coming out that were like it were moving into the romance phase quicker than I was. So in order to temper the people's impatience with me, I put that in the summary. And I think it applied for like years. And it's only now that people are like, this isn't a slow burn. And I think that's fair. I think that pacing, like the expectations for pacing have changed. But I still think that it is essentially a slow burn in that the relationship itself does not resolve until the very end of the story. For me, what's slow about it is that they're sort of slow to give in. They both think of it, initially they're opposed to it, it's happening against their will, and then they both think of it as like a temporary thing, and then they really only decide like, okay, we're in this now in chapter, the end of chapter 28 or 29 or something, out of the 30 that are there. So in terms of slow burn style, I don't think it's a style. I think it has to be an intention. I'm sure that may have just been a word you used, and that's fine. But I think that what you're really asking me is, how do I figure out how to pace a story where the relationship development is slow compared to, the thing is that like, you can't just say the relationship development is slow. I don't think you can say objectively that things are slow unless it's like, Pride and Prejudice, like brief little hand touches. Yeah, you can agree those are slow. But, Clean is slow compared to Ride or Die, where they are like, boom, attracted to each other immediately, and they are in this by chapter 4. These are different relationship dynamics that you can choose from. You can have that insta love, insta attraction, or you can have something that builds over time, which is much more common in the enemies to lovers situation. In the stories where they fall for each other right away, it tends to be, very AU, or like in my books where they fall for each other right away, it's because they don't really know each other very well. It's this context where they're not working from something. So certain tropes like enemies to lovers require a slower burn because they hate each other to begin with. And if you remove that element, then then what are you building? You're building a spark, and that's going to go much faster. So it's really a question of how do you pace from your starting point, which is either they are opposed to each other, they are rivals, they are friends, but aren't considering a relationship, to that's your point A, to your point B of them being together. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can do it in terms of their commitment to each other. One of the very common dynamics is that, it's like just a friends with benefits type situation, or enemies with benefits. I don't know what you're planning, where it's purely sexual. Some people may not consider that a slow burn, but I think that it is, depending on how you build your arc, or what is your arc. The arc to me is the relationship. The happily ever after is not they have sex for the first time. It's they are, in some committed fashion, then they both agree that they're in a relationship. Or you have, you could have a friends to lovers dynamic. Neither of them wants to be the person who breaks the stalemate. You could have a lot of miscommunications between them. I think that's very common in novels of manners, like Jane Austen's work or Edith Wharton, where there are sort of society rules that are in the way. Also very common in most romance novels, that there is some sort of miscommunication or something that's barring them from being together that is outside of their control. And however you do this, all of these things could be a slow burn, just depending on how you construct the arc and how you decide to pace things. I think fanfiction is a great way to learn how to please an audience. I just came across the term this week, a writer's writer, which is someone who is writing in order for you to appreciate the way that they're writing or what they're constructing. A lot of literary works fall into this category, where it's not really pleasant to read until you understand the craft and what the writer has put into it. And fan fiction is completely the opposite. You are not writing fan fiction for other writers. You are writing fan fiction for an audience who knows exactly what they want, and they've come to you for a very specific thing. They have decided they want to read this pairing and this trope, and they want to make sure there are none of these triggers, and the recipe leads to your fic, right? So there are different rules for how you please a fanfiction audience versus how you please a book audience who maybe is there to just appreciate the construction, the craft in your work. Fanfiction, you are here to please people who came for what they wanted. And what they want, this is something that I think you have to learn based on feedback. Part of the reason that I value fanfiction so much, and the way that I always wrote in installments, is that I knew if I was taking too long, because the comments would be like, I wish this would happen, or, are they ever going to do this? Or just admit you're feeling this way. You can sense from the comments, even if they're enjoying the story, whether they're frustrated or not. So sometimes you do have to gauge that for yourself. This is also why I never outlined my fics in advance. There was never a purpose to it, because my audience would change my perception of what needed to happen. Or, sometimes something would happen and they would be like, that was fast, or I don't really understand why that happened. And then you'd have to sort of adjust and kind of back up and say, not every comment is accurate and matters. Not that the readers don't matter. I mean, in terms of your plot and how you want to build the story, not every review matters. But if you're trying to build something that feels gradual and people in the comments are telling you this feels like it's moving very quickly, that's something that you want to reflect on and consider moving forward. Maybe you want to place another obstacle in their way, or if there's too many obstacles and they're like, come on, hurry up. Which sort of happened in, How to Win Friends and Influence People is one of those weird ones where there's a lot that both pushes them together and keeps them apart. So that story is actually quite a slow burn, almost to the point where people do get frustrated because they're like, we already know they have feelings for each other, but they haven't admitted it to themselves. And you kind of have to gauge for yourself whether your audience is frustrated and they're maybe not coming back from week to week, or whether it's exciting to them and they're still sort of on board with how this is being built. There's lots of ways to speed up your plot, to make something, sort of convenient happen, or to slow it down if things have happened to either with plot points or events, or you can branch off into little side plots or, something how you pace, I think especially with fan fiction, will often turn out to be sort of like a retrospective reparative. It often was for me. So I guess as the first thing, is just to tell you that you do want to be responsive to your audience. You want to take advantage of fan fiction for the medium that it is. This is not a novel. You'll never learn better than you will from fan fiction what pisses people off and what makes an audience put a book down, because you're right there and it's live. So a lot of this is just trial and error. What I would maybe know going into the story is what you intend to be your like act 1, act 2, act 3. You probably know your starting point. Let's say they hate each other. They know each other, they hate each other. And your midpoint is, okay, they warm to each other. And maybe something happens between them, but they are still rationalizing because they still hate each other. And you eventually want to take them to they love each other. So you have to kind of envision the arc and then figure out how long does it logically take to get from point A to point B to point C. Depending on what else is going on with your plot, that might be a really long time or it might not. But how you do it, there is no right answer to that. It depends if I'm writing a drama or a comedy too. That's the other thing. It's like How to Win Friends and Influence People is a really long comedy full of miscommunications and errors, all of which happen because the characters themselves are, put against this backdrop of the tone of the story is things go wrong. And sometimes things go wrong in a way that forces them together, and sometimes things go wrong in a way that forces them apart. And then you have a drama like Clean, where a lot of stuff is just out of their control. The setting is that there's a war going on, and there's all these people who just genuinely want them dead. You have to decide your setting, decide your stakes, decide how long realistically, if you were one of these characters. I love how I'm like, in order to write, you have to think about all of the elements of writing. All of this comes down to, this is your stakes, your setting, your characterization. How long would it take all of these characters to get their house in order, It's dependent on the characters' personalities. It's dependent on what kind of setting. It's dependent on the tone of the story. And I think when you make those decisions and act accordingly, it comes together. Was there an answer in there? I hope so. I think it just, you just want to think about the slow burn in terms of pacing. You have an end goal, and how do you get yourself there without skipping any logical steps, which you figure out based on the character's stakes and setting. I'm very tired, you guys. Okay, so this wasn't, I got a lot of writing questions that I had answered before. This was one that I think I remember talking about, but let's talk about it again, which is, do you have any tips on how to write diversity, race, ethnicity, disability, sexuality? This is a hard question. I don't think there is a correct answer to this question. I mean, partially because this is really hard, especially I'm finding with traditional publishing, because I come from fan fiction where you can kind of do whatever. Like there are problematic things, but you can slap triggers on them. And also you're working with somebody else's characters, so there's not too much you can change. Have I tried to write diversely? Yes, in terms of sexuality and sometimes in terms of whether the characters are like on the spectrum or dealing with mental health issues. But it's, but like in terms of race, ethnicity, that was not something I really concerned myself with at the time. It was just like, this is what's in the book, and so this is what I'm going to write. And then as I started writing my own books, the question contextually really rose up of like, is this my story to tell? And that's really hard because I think there have been some books recently. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is a big one because it's noticeably white. It's very white. And Victoria Schwab is white, so it's kind of like, it's a kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't, where we don't really want her to write something that doesn't belong to her, but we also have to wonder why this character wanders around for 300 years and never leaves Western society, never kind of expands beyond this very Eurocentric plot. And she not only doesn't run into, like, she doesn't seem to run into anyone really. Like, she runs into a lot of male authors and painters, and she doesn't really see any people of color. And it's just kind of like, okay, it's noticeably lacking. And even the character of Addie LaRue herself feels very whiny for being a white woman. Because it's kind of like, Addie, like, for all the times you've been caught stealing, it's a good thing you're a white girl, right? Like, it's weird that, like, this never occurs to her. And you can tell it doesn't occur to her because it doesn't occur to the author, who's a white girl. So I'm not going to make a judgment on the book based on its whiteness. I think that it is noticeably white, and we can point at it and say this is a very whitewashed book, and I don't know whether she should have done things differently. Because then we also have books with white authors who do things very wrong, or who sensationalize people of color, or the stories of people of color, or they write from an experience they just can't possibly know. Which, like, it's kind of like how I wouldn't expect a male author to be able to write my story. I just don't think he'd get it right. He'd just miss a lot of the microaggressions I faced, or he wouldn't think of them as microaggressions. There's just no way he could even understand that. And I also understand that about other people's experiences. I don't really understand what it's like to have certain types of disabilities, or I have said before that I have absolutely no idea how to write an asexual character. That's just not even close to my experience. It essentially comes down to two things. One is that you really have to know what you write. And whether that means research or experience or what, you have to really understand why you've chosen to write a certain perspective and what your goal is with that perspective. Really understanding why a character is the way that they are, which isn't to say that we have to justify every gay character or every character of color or anything like that. Part of it is just like the world that we live in. I write the world that I see, and the world that I see is very diverse. When I look around at my life, I don't see a whole bunch of white people, which is why there aren't a whole bunch of white people, and certainly not a whole bunch of straight people. So what I write into my books is a reflection of my experience, which for me is biracial and mentally ill and honestly not very straight. So that's just, how things end up turning out, because I am the writer. This is the experience I know, and this is the experience I write. However, I do think it's very important to identify that there are better people to tell certain experiences. Like, I think one of the things that's gotten really conflated in the Own Voices dialogue discourse is that, there's a lot of there's a lot of authors who have been forced to basically out themselves because people are accusing them of telling a story that doesn't belong to them. And there's something weird about that. It's not that part of the problem with, the Own Voices idea is that what we wanted was to be able to tell our own stories, but not so that one person owned that story. So yeah, that's kind of, I don't really want to get into the weird publishing industry parts of it, where honestly the problem is that the decision makers are one type of person, and then the stories that are being demanded are another, the rest of the world. But I think that when you're trying to write diversely, I think the most important thing is, do I really know, do I really feel that I know the ins and outs of this experience well enough to write it? And the second part of that question that's really more important is, am I the right person to tell this story? Like in fan fiction, I've told a lot of queer stories. But when it comes to traditional publishing, I am, like I said, I'm biracial. I'm a first-generation American. I feel comfortable owning and telling those stories. Do I feel comfortable telling all queer love stories? Not really. I'm a woman that's married to a man, and whatever my actual sexual orientation is, I understand what the optics are. I understand that I will never know the experience of two teenage boys who fall in love. And so as much as I would maybe want to tell a story where that was a central plot line, I don't necessarily think I'm the right person to tell that story. And the other thing is that you never make the presumption that you are the right person to tell every story, because you're not. I would be remiss if I didn't include other experiences. And so sometimes that means really talking to someone about their culture, their experience, what this has really meant for them. I think it just always comes back to the knowledge of you can write the world that you see. You should write the world that you see and the world that you experience. But you should also be open to the experience of broadening and of including, of being inclusive without co-opting other people's stories, because other people are capable of telling their own story. I think as long as you always remember that the people that maybe you want to write for whatever reason are capable of telling their own stories. So have you made someone else's story the central plot to yours? That would be a problem, I think. That's part of the problem with like a lot of, TV shows and movies or whatever, where the cast is diverse, but it centers around a white character because the writers and the producers or the creators or whatever are white. That's an industry problem. That's beyond what you would have to worry about, I think. But yeah, I think that, yes, I'm repeating myself a lot. I want a cookie. I really want cheesy bread. If you're writing an experience that is your own, then yes, you can center your experience. Otherwise, do not make it about you. Especially if you're writing another culture or another experience that has been really marginalized. You really want to talk to someone who has lived that experience, and you want to be able to feel confident that you are representing their experience in an authentic way. And not that you decide that, but that they confirm that for you. But again, it's a tough argument. So anyway, I hope that helps. I'm starving really abruptly. I'm also exhausted. So I'm going to go. I think next week someone had a question about self-publishing, which we'll see. And we'll talk about the spell read, which I haven't thought about yet, but will have posted by the time this video posts. Anyway. This has been me, Olivie Blake, not writing, and I'll see you next week.